Okay, well, I think we should start. Welcome, everybody. First of all, I hope you are all well, given the situation we all find ourselves in. My name is Mark Isherwood, and I lead the DDEX Secretariat along with my colleague Niels. I will give a very brief overview of DDEX, and then Niels will talk in a reasonable amount of detail about the MEAD Standard and how it relates to ERN and where we see the future of the standard moving forward. So as I say, welcome everybody. This is the first series of these webinars that we have put together, and obviously we hope you will find it informative. But we do really welcome your feedback, both during the webinar, and we would ask you to use the chat in order to ask questions if you have any. And please feel free to jump in as we go along. There's no need to wait until the end. And also, if you think of something after the webinar, you can email us at info@ddex.net. We will also be forwarding you a link to a very short questionnaire about the webinar in order to try and gain some feedback and learn if we're doing it right or wrong, or how well, and so on. So as I said, please feel free to ask questions using the chat facility as we go along. I would also remind you, if you haven't done so already, obviously there is a series of these, as I've mentioned, and the next three of these you can see up there on the slide. If you haven't registered for these, please go to the Events tab on the DDEX website at ddex.net. So we're doing the Digital Sales report and Claim Detail Message on the 30th of April, the Recording Information Notification on the 7th of May, and then Recording Data and Rights on the 28th of May. That set of standards was formerly known as the MLC set of standards, but we're changing the acronym because of the confusion brought about by the creation of the Mechanical Licensing Collective in the US as part of the MMA Act. So please, if you haven't signed up, please go to events and on the DDEX website and sign up for those three and any future webinars that we've got lined up. As you will find as this series progresses, DDEX is not just about the individual formats for the individual messages, which are all tailored to carry certain types of data relating to a specific business transaction, but also the choreographies. That is really a set of triggers between business partners as to who sends what and when. And finally, the actual protocols by which that exchange of data is undertaken. Up until relatively recently, most of that has been through SFTP sites, but increasingly we are now moving towards web services and other more automated mechanisms and protocols for communication. And some of those things will come up over the series of webinars. Just a reminder, if you're not a member of DDEX, we would obviously welcome you to do so. There are three categories. Basically, full members get to be involved in everything DDEX does except have a seat on the board, and the annual fees are determined by revenue, which is the table of which is there, but obviously all this is also on the website. The other category is charter members, and they basically get the same benefits as the full members. And the only addition to what charter members get from full members is that they can nominate a board member. There's a limit of 21 companies on the board, and they pay obviously a significantly higher fee. And then finally, we have associate members who don't actually participate in the work, but have access to the documents and various elements of what we do under certain conditions. And they pay a flat fee per annum of $2,675, which the sharp-eyed amongst you will realize is higher than two of the full member fees, because we actually do try and encourage smaller companies, startups, to become members. And indeed, of the 120 odd companies we currently have as members, about 30% of those are indeed companies that are startups or have a revenue below 2 million. So they form dollars. They form a very important part of what we do. The Jib Map that you can see in front of you, or Metro Map, depending on which city you come from, this demonstrates all of the various message suites that we have and the types of companies that use those messages to actually communicate data. And today we are talking about the MEAD standard principally, and that is enables communication between record companies, distributors, metadata companies, and DSPs. And as we will show in more detail, this is not the kind of data that makes up an ERN message, which is much more about the standing data around describing a release or recording and the deals associated with it. This is about more advanced data that isn't usually associated with rights management or supply chain requirements. One thing I would say about all of the DDEX standards, and the thing that underpins them all, which is our data dictionary. And it is the mechanisms by which all of the terms in all of the messages are contained and structured together, and where every term that we use is commonly defined. And if you've never looked at DDEX before and you want to get a feel for it, then we often suggest that starting with the data dictionary is a good place, because you can start to see how everything sort of fits together. So if you're new to this, then that's a good place to start. I'm going to hand over to Niels now, and he will talk about MEAD in a bit of detail, and hopefully that will be of interest to everyone. I'll hand over to Niels.
Thank you very much, Mark. And let me reiterate what Mark said earlier or at the beginning. If you have any questions, please do stop me by using the chat function, and we will try to answer any questions that you may have. The whole MEAD standard started from the realization that bigger screen sizes, traditionally at least, used to lead to a richer experience. The original iPod or MP-Man, as the very first MP3 player was called, they had very small screens. There was very little information that was displayed on their screens. There was very little interaction between the user and the device or the music. That becomes much easier, much better on mobile phones with their now quite large screens or iPads and the like, and even more so when you're looking at a computer screen. But more and more devices do not have any screens. If you're looking at your typical smart speaker, as they're called, they don't have any way to interact with the user other than to either play the music or to ask questions to be clarified. And if the device asks you questions back, that's not really a very compelling user experience. On a screen, that's fine. It looks like you're choosing something. But if it's on a speaker, it's not a very nice experience. So we do need to have some kind of artificial intelligence that can actually make the screens disappear without us actually realizing that we don't have any screens anymore, and enabling us, the consumer, to actually enjoy the music meaningfully. The companies that operate the services behind those speakers gave us a number of examples of queries that the users are speaking into those smart devices and that they then have to deal with. Google, play me something from Slowhand. Or Alexa, play me the song Eneman sampled in Stan. Siri, play me Ed Sheeran's latest track. Or Cortana, play me something from the female singer on the live version of Don't Give Up. This is quite a complex question that needs to be entangled, all the information that needs to be taken out of there, and then the right piece of music needs to be played. So let's use the last thing as an example. Please play something from the female singer of the live version of Don't Give Up. You need to know popular tracks called Don't Give Up. You need to be able to differentiate live versions versus studio versions. You need to have the lineups of those tracks. You then need to identify a prominent singer on one of those tracks and find another track of that singer. So hopefully you will have then identified Paula Cole as the singer, and you play some music by Paula Cole. Hopefully your device will not come up with Kate Bush, because she was the lead female voice on the studio version of Don't Give Up. Or the other example that's always used, or that's quite often used, play me Ed Sheeran's latest track. Because what does the latest mean? It does not mean actually the one that was most recently released. In fact, it's typically the one that a record company wants to push, or the one that is currently being used quite often in the radio. And that's something that record companies can actually communicate through their marketing campaigns to DSPs. So where does all this metadata come from? There are tons of sources for it, but certainly it's the record companies. It's their normal supply chain systems. Some of the information that we've just talked about is part of the ERN message. The title of the song, whether it's a live version or a studio version, the list of people that contributed to that song, and so forth. Other bits, such as the impact dates and those kind of things, are part of the marketing systems of the record companies. But it's not always just the record companies that can provide that information. There's a myriad number of metadata providers, as we call them, companies such as Gracenote or Jackster, that provide information to other companies in the music industry value chain. It's their job to curate good information and to make that available to other people. And it's those companies, as well as utilities such as Music Brains, for example, that actually can provide the metadata that the smart speakers need to provide a compelling user experience. Of course, all of that information can also be used for devices with a screen, but the impetus for DDEX to actually develop the MEAD standard is to satisfy the needs of screenless devices. So what's the choreography that we're having? It's, as with most DDEX standards, actually comparatively simple. you have a record company that needs to send information to a DSP. Well, they're sending something anyway, which is the ERN message. It's the release notification message. The stuff that tells the DSP what the stuff is, the core metadata, as well as how the DSP is allowed to make that available. Alongside of this metadata about the release, the ERN message itself, there will be the resource files, so the MP3s or AACs or whatever the encoding may be. Plus, they can communicate MEAD messages that provide richer information. Equally, third-party metadata providers can provide MEAD messages to DSPs. They would not send them together with an ERN message because there is no ERN feed from metadata providers to DSPs. That's just from record companies to DSPs. But they can use the existing MEAD Choreography standard to basically send their information. The line is dashed on this diagram from the metadata provider to the DSP because the initial implementations that we are seeing being done at this moment will be from record companies to DSPs as an accompaniment to an ERN message, because that's where the biggest need is. This play me the latest Ed Sheeran song is the biggest headache for the providers of services to smart speakers at this stage. So we expect third-party metadata providers to come a little bit later into the play when it comes to providing MEAD messages. And record companies, by the way, are also potentially metadata providers, and they can provide MEAD messages not attached to an ERN feed like a third-party metadata provider as well. So those are the three ways in which we see MEAD to be communicated. So how is that done? Well, either it's sent alongside an ERN message, and it's basically, in this case, we treat the MEAD file, the MEAD message, just like another resource. You have your ERN message, you have your 10 or however many MP3 files, and you have a number of MEAD files that then provide additional rich information about the musical works, about the sound recordings, about the releases, or about the parties, the recording artists, the writers that are in the album, in the sound recordings. All of that will be provided as one delivery. And in ERN 4, the current version of ERN that is also currently being implemented by a large number of companies, there's actually a slot in the message where you can say, oh, by the way, here are a number of MEAD messages that provide rich information for the information that I've just sent you a deal for and the core metadata for. ERN 3, which predates MEAD, of course, we don't have that luxury, but there is actually an agreement how to use MEAD together with ERN 3. It's simply a text resource like the lyrics file, if somebody wants to send a lyrics file with an ERN message, but with a specific text type of MEAD message so that the DSP knows that this is actually not a resource to be shown to consumers, but it actually contains metadata, rich metadata. The second approach that we expect people to use MEAD with is in a web service architecture, and that can be either symmetric, where both sides have a web service, or an asymmetric web service approach. The symmetric approach is simple, where a release distributor, as we call them, that's a DSP in normal language, they receive an ERN message or any other information flow that they now have a release. They want to ingest that. But the editorial team or system would want to get additional information on the items that they have just ingested, and they would simply ask the web service of a metadata provider, hey, can you please provide me with information about this music, about this musical work or this sound recording or this musician, and can you please, whenever you have something, send that to me? That's kind of a subscription to a metadata service, and typically the answer would be yes, and here's your subscription numbers. And then whenever the metadata provider learns of a new fact, maybe the artist has suddenly peaked and is now in the charts in Australia, and we want to make sure that that information is provided as part of the MEAD message. At that stage, a web service call from the metadata provider to the DSP could be initiated with the relevant information. That information can then be amalgamated into the database of the DSP and shown to the consumer. It's a very simple approach. It has one major drawback. Both sides need to maintain web services, which is why we then also have a asymmetric approach where only the metadata provider provides such a web service, and the release distributor would simply always call the metadata provider. A subscription would happen in exactly the same way, and then whenever the DSP in blue wants to have new information, it would simply ask the metadata provider, hey, do you have something new for me? And here are my subscription numbers. Or maybe the metadata provider knows if I'm calling, these are my subscriptions. And if they have something, they will send me a list of the new items from which I can then, again using web service, receive one and the next item until I'm have ingested all the information, and I can then show that to the consumers. Both of those approaches, symmetric and asymmetric, are actually already in use in the context of the ERN standard. So this is actually nothing new for DDEX. We have just adapted it for the use with the MEAD standard. But as usual, the music industry lives off FTP for the time being, and the first initial implementations we expect would be with FTP. And it again follows the ERN choreography there, where people can have file by file and batched deliveries. Can I please have one piece of information? Here is that piece of information. Or can I have please these bits of information? And then you get multiple information back. The only major difference between this choreography and the ERN FTP choreography is that there is no hard disk delivery in this case, because that is something that really only applies to ERN because of the large volume of the resource files. MEAD is metadata only, so it just does not apply. So, what does MEAD contain? It contains information about parties, musical works, sound recordings or videos, or releases. And when I say it does contain all of those, well, no, it contains typically stuff about one of those entities. But let me go through the other bits that are shown there on the right-hand side. All DDEX messages have a message header, which basically just says who sent something to whom, when was that message being created, so that, well, it's bookkeeping, isn't it? I talked about the subscription earlier. Well, here is the way to include the subscription in the message so that the recipient and the sender know that a specific MEAD message belongs to a specific metadata subscription. Thereby, it's much easier for them to ingest that information. One very, very interesting aspect of MEAD, and in which it differs significantly from all other standards, is this # other item at the end of the XML schema definition. This allows companies to just extend the MEAD standard by adding information that they and data structures that they need for their own need. So if a metadata service provider and a DSP agree that there is something in addition to what the current version of MEAD allows, but they need that for their communication, they can simply add that into the messages, and it is still a valid file. Clearly, that requires those two parties to agree the semantic of those additional fields, and DDEX certainly hopes that that would then be brought to DDEX so that we can add it to the message properly, into the standard properly, but it has the ability for people to extend the MEAD message to their heart's content. And that's something that's quite important. All the other DDEX messages are fairly well structured in the sense that they contain the information necessary for the business purposes envisaged, but nothing else. MEAD can contain all kinds of information and is intended to contain all kinds of information, as much as possible. The more, the merrier. And the other thing that is very important with respect to the MEAD message, especially when it comes from third-party metadata providers, is information about who sent that information and who authored that information. Typically, and that applies to all the DDEX messages, apart from MEAD, they come from a single source to a single recipient. The sales report sometimes is from one source to multiple recipients, but that is kind of an edge case. Here, a DSP may receive information about the same entity from many different sources. And some of those elements are journalistic, some things like biographies, photographs, and so forth. And some of that information should actually better come from an authoritative source, historic charting information. If a label would rather inflate their artists' charting positions, one could imagine. But if that information actually comes from those charting organizations themselves, wouldn't that be make the information much more reliable? And that's where this metadata source is so important. Let me give you an example. So here is a biography, which I just copied from Wikipedia. Hence, the author is listed there as Wikipedia, from John Lennon. Wouldn't it be good if you knew that I put that together? Yeah, it would be good if you knew that I put that together, but would it be much better if it were coming from UMG, who are actually the label to whom John Lennon would be signed if he were still alive, and that they are a rights controller to the sound recording that we're talking about, rather than just some arbitrary person on the internet. And then you can link those two bits of XML together, and now you say that this biography, written by Wikipedia, has been provided by UMG, and they stand by the fact that this is actually the biography written by Wikipedia. And this is quite an important piece of information. I've already hinted at the fact that MEAD is a big bucket in which information can be thrown in. Virtually everything is optional in that message. That allows niche metadata providers to add their expertise into their little niche. One aspect I've hinted at that is charting position. We would expect that charting companies might want to expose all of their charting information through some kind of interface for people to pull that information down. For all kinds of countries, back in history, with the information from whom that charting information comes from, but that is only possible because all the other fields in the message are optional. A charting company would unlikely provide genre information or beats per minute information or those kind of information. That's not what they're doing. They're just doing charts, and the MEAD message must support that they're just doing charts. Yet, MEAD is a statement of truth. So when you receive a MEAD message from a specific metadata provider, and they then send you another MEAD message about the same entity, then the second message overrides the first message. Not augments, but overrides the first message. That's in line with all the other DDEX messages as well. So what are the fields that it supports? This list is not exhaustive, but that's what it provides. So some of them are pretty clear and pretty obvious. Focus track is the thing that I explained earlier with Ed Sheeran. But things like, where has something been used? Has it been used in the 2012 Olympics or at the Super Bowl 50? Or what are the photos about an artist or that are linked to an album? Time signatures, harmonic information, mood, styles, genre, themes, lyrics text can be provided. Alternative titles, nicknames, classical work hierarchies, links to other recordings, and so forth. And quite interesting, all the free-form information can be accompanied with pronunciation information. I'm pretty sure those who are not native English speakers, but if you try to speak with your smart speaker in your native language, when I try that here at home in German with a smart speaker that I have, the results are pretty horrible, both in terms of what the device can understand as well as how it pronounces things. If we could provide titles, artist names, and the like with pronunciation information, the user experience would be so much better. MEAD allows that to happen. We prefer IPA as the International Phonetic Alphabet, but other phonetic transcription methods can be used as well, but IPA is the only one that really works on a worldwide basis. Let me just quickly go where we see MEAD going in the future, and then we can have a look at the XML itself and delve into a little bit into the structure of the message. I've already said that we see at the moment the initial thrust to be record companies to send information to DSPs. Labels initially, and then metadata providers will do that in addition. But that's a proactive mode. They're just sending the stuff based on a query that they may once have received. In the future, we can very well see that MEAD becomes some kind of a database access language, where the DSP, the metadata provider, the metadata provider just sits, relaxes, and people then ask that database, hey, can you please provide me with information about, and then you have a quite complex search string. And the reply would then be, obviously, a MEAD message with the relevant information. That can then help people to provide the information they need for AI, but also for other research jobs. If you want to know when Eric Clapton was #1 in China for either some kind of a radio station wants to do something in that sense, well, that might be actually the way to get that information out of a database. But of course, also if you want Alexa to provide that information to you. But this is not in version 1, the capability of doing that. We're just doing the proactive mode for the time being. And last but not least, we're already working on MEAD version 1.1. There is no ETA for version 1.1 at this stage. We do not know when that will come along, but there are some changes that I just wanted to highlight. For one, and that applies to all the DDEX standards, we're separating the data dictionary in two different parts, one that provides you with a structure and one that provides all the allowed values, the code lists. We're splitting dance and rhythm style, for example, into two tags, dance style and rhythm style. Initially, we thought that we could get away with having one tag for both, but actually looking at it a bit more closer, really realized that does not work well. The same happens to theme and mood. Those were just slightly rejigged. And we will correct one slight oddity in that the impact date, which is the date when a sound recording basically started to get airplay or started to get used. At the moment, is part of the usage composite. It will be spelled out as a separate composite in version 1.1. But that doesn't give any added functionality. It just makes that impact date much more visible than it is at the moment. But as I said, there is no estimated time of arrival for version 1.1 at this stage. Good. That's all I had prepared slide-wise. We can now have a look and play a little bit. Play a little bit with standard. But I don't know whether there are any questions for the time being. I don't see any on the chat. So this is basically how a MEAD message, an empty MEAD message looks like. As I said, it all starts with a header, and you would need to send that from, let's say, I don't know, a message from Warner Music, and in DDEX messages, these dashes don't exist because they're for human readability, to, let's say, Amazon, and when was that created? Well, it's today, it's March 26th. Sorry, it's 1713. And what do we want to talk about? Well, we can talk about, I don't know, let's talk about a party. So we need some information about a party. Which party are we talking about? Let's talk about, I don't know, the Proclaimers. And we want to give them an ISNI, to provide the ISNI for the Proclaimers. There is the ISNI, and again. And what we want to communicate is, for example, what is the current hit that everybody would want to send for that, and that is the focus track. If you ask Alexa, hey, play me the latest Proclaimers song, well, you want something from the Proclaimers. Maybe we can have this ISRC, and the focus track also has a title and a subtitle. So with this message, Warner Music can inform Spotify that if somebody asks for the latest track for the Proclaimers, to provide back, I'm going to be 500 miles. Very simple, very, very short message. And we can go further and saying, let's provide some information about this sound recording. So it's a resource. The resource, well, it's an ISRC. And what could we provide? Well, we could provide chart information or genre information. So we have I just see the question. What is the information of a focus track? Is it always the latest? No, that is the funny thing about focus track. It's not always the latest, because the latest may not be the latest that is a big hit. It is quite often or typically it is the one that a record company wants to push for a specific artist. It's the one that is currently played most by radios in a specific territory. So, yeah, is it entirely defined by the label? Not necessarily. It's from a MEAD message, which comes from a label to a DSP. Yes, the label says, this is the track we want you to push for this artist. Whether the DSP then actually does that, or they realize, hang on, in the UK, it's actually that song that everybody wants. And in that case, they might actually deviate from what the label would like to be pushed. But from the DDEX message, from the MEAD message, you're right. It's the label that says, that's the big one that I want you to push. So what we have a genre. Well, it's rock music, isn't it? And some people call this I don't know, Celtic rock. So it's a user-defined value, Celtic rock. And you need to say who says that it's Celtic rock. Well, it would be Warner Music that says that. Or it may be that someone else says that this is Celtic rock, and that you may want to say, actually, there is someone else who provides that. So you can provide a metadata source. So someone has provided that information that it is rock. Let's just remove this for readability. So you now need to then include into the message metadata source information. This is the U1 again from at the bottom, and the metadata source. Well, let's just first have a party name, Grace node, and they are a meta provider. Suddenly, this genre that we have provided here becomes an entirely different feel for it. It's not just provided by Warner Music, but it's actually provided by a metadata company who built their reputation partly on genre classifications. And we can provide information such as historic charting information. So, I don't know, in Austria, in Australia, in the ARIA charts, that thing became top position 1. And you can then also say, well, things like, I don't know, the first week of 2008, in 1988, for 1 week, I guess at the beginning, it was at position 2. And information like that. And you can have multiple of that information. And then you can have, I don't know, another historic charting information in Germany from the official German charts, and well, the Germans didn't like that song, it just went to 40 there. And quite important here is, where does that information come from? So you would then add some information about the metadata source, add another metadata source in here, U2 to point down, the type would begin a metadata company, and the party name would be the official German charts. So now we have a valid, as you can see at the corner here, a valid XML message. You have two different metadata sources that Warner would like to communicate. One is Gracenode and one is the official German charts, and you provide party information about the proclaimers, and you'll then have a subtitle here and information about the sound recording. ISRC, and your ISRC identifies the sound recording. You have a genre, you have historic charting information, and what you then also can provide is not just the title text, but also pronunciation information. So you can then have on this in IPA, and I can't write IPA, but how this is meant to be pronounced. And you can even say that's the pronunciation for English, whereas in France it would be pronounced slightly different, or those kind of information, if that is critical. Looking at the structure itself and looking about a party, these are the various different things that you can talk about a party. A party being typically a writer or a recording artist, whether that's an individual or a band. So the Beatles would be a party as well as John Lennon. And you can provide vocal register. Who says that someone is a baritone? And here is the vocal register with the usual list of values that you would have. You have information about, as we said, here is the information about a focus track, so which sound recording, with which title, what's the display artist name. So in the case of, I don't know, what's the focus track of John Lennon, that may very well be, focus track of John Lennon, may very well be a Beatles track. In this case, the display artist name would be the Beatles, and those things. You can provide multiple focus tracks. So play me the latest stuff from Ed Sheeran. Well, there might be 3 tracks that the label wants to push. So you can sequence them. And you can say, well, this is the focus track in January, this is the focus track in February, this is the focus track in March. The question that Anders asked is whether I could come up with some additional tag here. Let's just remove or collapse these. Yes, you can simply at the very end add, I don't know, shoe size of artist 42. You can simply have a shoe composite here, which then has the shoe size, as well as the color, as well as the style or whatever you want to do. So the complexity that you can do there is quite complex.
The sample shown during the webinar was unfortunately not valid. The sample now on the screen is valid, however. One needs to create an XML schema for the extension that then can be agreed between the sender of the MEAD message and the recipient, and this schema needs to be referenced as shown. Here is how that schema looks like. Looking into this issue has unearthed a little bug in the MEAD 1.0 schema. where the extension does not work as intended. I will be working with the ERN working group who maintains the MEAD standard to see how we can best correct this error.
Okay, well, I'm assuming that we've saturated you with information, and hopefully, as I said, you find that helpful. We have recorded this webinar, although Niels will do a little bit of editing to sort out the XML here, and should have that up on the site, on the DDEX.net website in the next couple of days under the tab of resources. But in the absence of any further questions, I think we're done. So thank you very much for your time. I hope you found that helpful. And we look forward to having you attend our next webinar on the 30th of April. So have a good evening and everybody stay well. Thank you very much.